Today we begin the build-up to the Civil War. We can see the roots of the Civil War go all the way back to the Constitution, and we'll get there in just a minute. It is a crisis over the peculiar institution, a nice euphemism for slavery. We talk a lot in history about the Civil War, and especially here in South Carolina, which holds a special place in Civil War history, about this Civil War. A lot of people, especially in the South, are going to argue that the Civil War is about states' rights, and that is true to some extent. But we cannot look at Civil War without understanding the Civil War as a fight over slavery. It doesn't mean abolition. We'll get to that in just a little bit. The Civil War takes the shape it takes because of westward expansion. Westward expansion led to sectionalism, which means each section was concerned with its own interests, and by that we're talking about the North and its free soil interests, which we'll get to later, and the South and its slavery expansion interests. The interest of each region was amplified, and by far the largest issue was that of slavery. Yes, there was some discussion over tariffs, but tariffs wouldn't have been a problem had the South not had its system based on the plantation system, which was based on slavery. The regions were seeking a balance of power between free soil and slave states, which is rooted in the Constitution's Great Compromise. The House of Representatives, according to the Constitution, is decided by population size in each state. And the Senate is going to have equal representation regardless of the size. And the balance of power deals with the Senate. They wanted an equal number of slave states and free soil states. This is because over time, because of immigration and because the North had an alliance with the Western states, if you remember, this is over Henry Clay's American system, the North began to have a population advantage, and it could outvote the South on issues that concerned it. Now the North doesn't have a geographical advantage. This is an analogy, of course, a metaphor. The population was big, and the South could not protect itself in the House of Representation, or House of Representatives, even with the 3/5 compromise, which inflated its importance in the government. Remember the 3/5 compromise, 3/5 of every slave counted towards population. Southerners were fighting to maintain, therefore, a balance of power in the Senate, because it needed this balance in order to keep a majority of free soilers away. They could then use the filibuster, which would kill any legislation that could prevent slavery from expansion. They could essentially control the national government through the Senate. Because the Southerners wanted to maintain a balance of power, and the Free Soilers wanted to maintain that balance as well, at the very least, we had a series of compromises that occurred starting in 1820. The first major compromise was the Missouri Compromise. There was a tension occurring because Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state. Missouri is right here. Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state. However, that would throw off the balance of power in favor of the slave states. So they had to come up with a compromise. The compromise was this. Maine would come in as a free state. Missouri would then come in as a slave state. Maine was part of Massachusetts at that point. And then in order to prevent future conflicts, Congress decided that they were going to draw a line here in Missouri, or at the southern border of Missouri, the 3630 latitude, that would split the Louisiana Purchase in half. We can see that line right here. And they assumed that that would solve the problem. All this territory up here is unorganized desert territory at this point. It's a fertile land, but they didn't know how to farm it at that point. And this land down here, they assumed would take a long time to become territories as well. What's interesting is they assumed that if they had further expansion, remember, at this point, they assumed that they were going to take over all this territory as well. And that's later going to be the Mexican Cession. And they assumed that that line would just go all the way to the coast. And then that would split roughly half and half. Half free state, half slave state. This did settle the issue for about 30 years until the Texas annexation and the Mexican War. Remember that after the Texas Revolution, we refused to allow Texas to join the Union for about 9 years because of the slavery issue. The North was concerned, the Free Soilers were concerned that a large slave state was going to come in and throw off that balance of power. So they weren't really sure what to do with Texas. They decided to do nothing. And the North was concerned that a new large slave state would throw off that balance. The Northerners were also afraid that there was a pro-slavery conspiracy in the Polk administration. Polk is the man who is eventually going to force the annexation of Texas. Polk was also the man that was responsible, the president responsible, for giving up on the northern half of the Oregon Territory. Northerners saw that as a conspiracy against them to promote Southern values. Polk himself was interested in the Southern concerns. Polk's also going to provoke a war, not to just add Texas, which was a slave territory, but to all the modern Southwest, which we're going to call the Mexican Cession. That trend continued. The territory was going to be set aside to be slave-based. And they already gave up half the Free Soil territory, which was set aside with the northern half of the Oregon Territory. During the Mexican War, Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, a Northerner, proposed something referred to as the Wilmot Proviso. Wilmot was by no means an abolitionist. He was a free soiler. He was afraid that of those territories becoming slave-based and therefore would ruin the opportunities of northern whites to be able to buy that land. He wanted the United States to take all of that Mexican Cession territory and assert that any territories taken from Mexico would be labeled as free soil and would not be allowed to be slave-based. And it easily passed the House of Representatives. Remember, the North had larger population, but it's going to fail in the Senate because of the balance of power. The northern and western population allowed the proviso to pass, and the equal number of states in the Senate allowed the balance of power to kill off the obviously northern bias legislation. The lesson, of course, of the Wilmot Proviso, to the Southerners at least, is that without the balance of power in the Senate, the northern free states were going to take away slavery, which would then take away the Southern way of life. They'd lose their traditional way of life. They'd lose what amounted to, at that point, the single biggest investment in the United States. The slaves were worth more than all the railroads combined, all the shipping industries combined. It was the largest investment in the United States at that point. Worth about $75 billion today, if you were to add it all together. The balance of power was the only thing protecting this peculiar institution, again, a euphemism for slavery. The tensions were then increased after they found gold in California in 1849. The gold rush led to a rapid population gain, and California wanted to become a state, and California wanted to be a free soil state because there's a lot of miners there. The miners did not want slavery to enter California because then these large slave owners would move into California and use slaves to mine. They wanted to make sure it was free soil for those free labor, for the free whites. California was going to upset the balance of power, so they had to come up with a compromise. They could not have California come in as a free soil territory without having some sort of compromise. It would ruin the balance of power. So what was the compromise of 1850? Well, the North gets a few things. North gets California to come in as a free soil state, and in return, the Southerners wanted the Mexican Cession territory to be decided by something called popular sovereignty. We'll get to that in a second. Northerners were also upset that the District of Columbia, the heart of our constitutional government, still allowed the slave trade. In fact, 3 blocks from the Capitol building was a slave holding pen, a slave jail. So they wanted to get rid of that. In return, the South wanted to have a stricter fugitive slave law, which they're going to get as well. Free soilers were worried that this idea of popular sovereignty is literally, in this picture anyways, forcing the slavery down the throats of the free soiler. So this idea of popular sovereignty. The people of the territory can vote to decide whether to allow slavery or not. This allows the possibility of slavery in previously set-aside free soil territories as agreed to in the Missouri Compromise line of 3630. This becomes a big problem not in the Mexican Cession territory, but in the old Louisiana Purchase territory. especially in Kansas and Nebraska. That area north of the 3630 line was opened now to slavery, mainly because Representative Douglas wanted to build a railroad track through there. The pro and anti-slavery forces poured into Kansas after Kansas was made a slave state. It didn't want to be a slave state. The people there tended to be free soilers. However, the bordering Missouri population flooded into Kansas, voted to make it slave-based, and then left. So the pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, we're skipping a lot of history here, poured into Kansas, disrupted the vote. There's a controversy over who should be in charge. Pro and anti-slavery forces begin to turn into a small-scale civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. This is John Brown. John Brown was so upset after something called the caning of Charles Sumner, which I'll show you in a second, that he got so riled up he actually went and stole 5 pro-slavery settlers out of their homes, and in front of their wives and kids, took a broadsword to them, chopped them up into itty-bitty bits, and then left. This is the caning of Charles Sumner, by the way. Not only are we seeing violence within Kansas, we're seeing violence on the floors of the Senate. This is Charles Sumner right here. Charles Sumner was a senator. He gave a 6-hour speech promoting abolition and criticizing specifically certain members of the House of Representatives. This is Robert Brooks. Robert Brooks was a South Carolina House of Representatives member. One of the people that Charles Sumner insulted was Robert Brooks's uncle. And Robert Brooks decided that he needed to practice some Southern honor. Thought about threatening Charles Sumner to a duel, but that wasn't done yet anymore. So Robert Brooks decided he was just going to beat Charles Sumner to death with his cane, and came pretty darn close. Charles Sumner wouldn't come back to the halls of the Senate for 6 months. Robert Brooks, for his part, said he would retire. He resigned his office, and he would let the people of South Carolina tell him what he had done, if he was right or wrong. The people of South Carolina overwhelmingly reelected Preston Brooks, and Preston Brooks actually got about 100 memorial canes from his constituents saying, "Good job." We can see that the pro and anti-slavery animosity that led to the Bleeding Kansas is also going to lead to the reemergence of the free soil-based Republican Party. The emergence of that Republican Party. We'll get to that in a second. We can also see a stricter Fugitive Slave Act. Fugitive Slave Act in which African Americans in the North were supposed to be worried about kidnappers and slave catchers. Why such a big deal about kidnappers and slave catchers? Well, because these kidnappers and slave catchers were capturing not just runaway slaves, but could also potentially be capturing freedmen. So the Fugitive Slave Act. When a fugitive slave was caught, or somebody accused of being a fugitive slave was caught, they went to a trial, but they couldn't even testify on their own behalf. It was whoever the slave catcher was would go in front of this judge working on his own time, so he had to be paid extra. They'd go in front of a judge, and the slave master would, or the slave catcher would have to present his case. And if the commissioner, which was this judge, decided that the caught slave was a freedman, the commissioner got $5. If the commissioner decided that that caught slave was actually a slave, he got $10. Doesn't seem like much to us today. Think about that for a minute. He's getting paid double if he decides in favor of the Southern slaves. And this made Northerners furious. Northerners attempted to, after this, they didn't want to be assisting in this unjust system. Even the non-abolitionists were angry about this. And the Northerners attempted to circumvent, which is the word they use in the standards. What it means is to get around. They try to find a way to get around the law by assisting with the Underground Railroad. And at this point, the Underground Railroad is not so much underground anymore. People are openly violating this law in the North. And the South sees this as a general support of the abolition movement by the North. And they see that a northern conspiracy. The North was seen as southern conspiracy. Now the South is seen a northern conspiracy. And how important is this issue to the tensions? Well, if we look ahead in history just a little bit, this is in 1860, the Declaration of the Immediate Causes, which induced and justified the secession of South Carolina. In other words, this is the document that South Carolina wrote explaining why they decided to secede. This is the only part of the Constitution that they mention when they say that the North was not following the Constitution. It says, no person held to service or labor in one state escaping into another shall be discharged from such service, but shall be delivered up upon claim to the party to whom such service or labor may be due. What does that mean? It means the North wasn't helping out with the Fugitive Slave Act. So we say that the South seceded over states' rights, and that may be true, but it is the states' rights to maintain a slave system. The Compromise of 1850 maintained the status quo, but it increased the animosity between the sections. And that's going to take us to theme 2, upsetting that balance of power.